Welcome for those of you who came all the way to join this fantastic event, annual conference. And for those of you who just joined, welcome as well. My name is Ruqayya Abu Sharaf. I teach anthropology here at SFSQ. We are moving to the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean with our first speaker, Rana of University of Oxford, who will be sharing his thoughts on China and the idea of the Indo-Pacific.
I'm very glad that so far we have not had one of the tropes that you tend to get at more excitable discussions on the question of geopolitics of this region, which is the question of, or if it indeed it is a question of, when India and China are going to get together to form an alliance that will take over the world. I have to say that I'm relieved at least that we're not going to be knocking down quite that sort of straw man on any of these occasions. In fact, it's been very impressive quite how nuanced the discussion has been in the course of the last day and a half. I do want, though, to draw in further the question of China, the power that, in a sense, is very much on the minds of many in the region without actually, of course, physically, most obviously being in it. And in those terms, understanding how a combination of factors, historic, economic, and military, have come together to place China at its a sort of pivot point in terms of its intentions in this part of the world. So what I'm going to suggest is that there are indeed a variety of reasons why China's policies, I think, do give it additional leverage and influence in the greater Indian Ocean, as well as, of course, serving various interests of its own. At the same time, I'm also going to suggest that this puts forward a dilemma which China has not had to face before in, in this form and with this urgency, which is about its own capacity to take initiatives and lead in this region. So part of the question is whether China can indeed lead, and if so, where is it leading? So to think about that, let me, if I may, first start with a few comments about the history of the region. And again, we started yesterday with Thomas's wonderful historical exegesis on the question of how the various links and transnational connections across the Indian Ocean have changed over the past 200 years or so. I think it's fair to say that in maritime terms, traditionally China has been a power that deals with the Western Pacific, and the nature of geography is the obvious reason for that. And yet the scope of its ambitions has altered over the years, and perhaps over a longer period than people have necessarily always realized. And the Indian Ocean, again broadly defined, has been part of that ambition for some decades. I'm going to leave aside for now the historical precedent which China today has taken so strongly to its heart, the voyages of the Ming Dynasty Admiral Zheng He, who has spelt out a historical lesson of how one can send large tribute ships out to Southeast Asia and to the coast of Africa as a means, according to China, of exploring without colonizing, making obviously some rather pointed comments about other less peaceful-seeming powers, or, as the most recent academic research suggests, in fact, the Ming Dynasty attempting an early form of gunboat diplomacy, albeit without guns, suggesting that the Ming Dynasty Chinese were not, in fact, less enthusiastic colonizers than anyone else, they were just less successful. Instead, let us consider the changes in the connections in the region in the context of the more recent post-1945 order. And I use the word 1945 and not 1949, as in the Communist Revolution, deliberately, because one of the things that I think has not been sufficiently noticed, but I think is beginning to come more into focus, is the way in which the geopolitical order, both in the Pacific and more broadly in the part of the global south that surrounds the Indian Ocean, is linked to a variety of changes that come from the presence of Nationalist China, the old Chiang Kai-shek regime that was defeated by Chairman Mao in the ironic period of its dying days on the Chinese mainland between 1945 and 1949. And this particular state and those 4 years marked a weird but I think quite important global anomaly in which the China of those years pre-communist conquest were simultaneously very close to collapse, marked by massive corruption, economic problems, famine indeed, and ultimately a civil war that led to the defeat of the regime, at the same time as playing a major and significant role as a shaper of a new idea of Asia and the region beyond through post-colonial diplomacy. It should be remembered that the collapsing, corrupt, and in many ways incompetent nationalist regime of the time was also the internationally recognized representative of China at, for instance, the UN Security Council, which was, of course, instituted in 1946, and in a whole variety of international organizations, some of which continue to exist, many of which continue to exist today. One example, the Chinese nationalist participation in ECAFI, the Economic Committee on the Far East, which certainly included India also in terms of its reconstruction of regional order. One should bear in mind that in the year 1945, at the end of World War II, Nationalist China had a very powerful symbolic value, even while it had an extremely weak state. It was at that point still one of only a few sovereign non-Western nations. India, of course, would become independent within a couple of years, but it was not independent at that point. And that UN Security Council role, then as now, marks it as the only P5 member to come from what, broadly speaking, we would define as the Global South. It was also important in the context of the problematique of this conference in that it was, in a broad sense, Western and American oriented as a regime. But at the same time, Nationalist China was many things, but it was not a liberal state. It was essentially non-liberal. It had constitutional aspirations, some of which were implemented. But I think it stands as a very good example of an early and very flawed Asian developmental state in which, in many ways familiar from the Singapore and other cases, you had the subsuming of liberal political ideas to a state-directed developmental economic model. So, leaving behind the post-45 period, we then go through Mao's China, which again posited a different role for China in the global south, but certainly including much of the area included in this map, including the emergence of a post-colonial Africa. It saw itself, of course, as a leader in the socialist world, but also, of course, a presence in the new Bandung grouping as part of an alliance of African and Asian nations coming into being post-independence. And at that time, again, one can say many things about Mao's China, but as global non-liberal models went, it was a pretty clear one, and clearly that opposition to a liberal world model was absolutely central to Mao's China's self-projection in the wider world. I think there is an irony in terms of the era that emerged after that, the era of so-called reform and opening in China from 1978, indeed, up to the present, sometimes called China in transition, although people have pointed out that China has been in transition now for about 37 years, and indeed has probably been in transition longer than it was actually in stasis, if such a thing was indeed the case previous to that. The period since 1978 may have been the time when China was least directly concerned with projecting any kind of model, certainly a non-liberal one, to the outside world. This was because, despite its openness to changing globalization, it was essentially concerned with growing the domestic economy. And Deng Xiaoping's, at least in China, very famous 16-character slogan starting Tao Guang Yang Hui, the idea of bide your time, hide your splendor under a cover and develop yourself at home and then in full time show your power, was a slogan very much taken to heart by Chinese leaders. Other factors also turned China inward in terms of its actual interests, upheavals like Tiananmen Square, 1989, and the increasing fixation on the relationship with the United States, driven by the dynamic of the increasing intertwining of the Chinese and American economies, what Neil Ferguson has called Chimerica. That changed significantly in the early 2000s for a variety of reasons, and I think we are still living today with the unfolding consequences of that set of changes. I will give you the factors that I think, in headline terms, are most important in terms of affecting that change. The first is the slowing of the third wave of democratization and the increasing move away from the assumption of democratization theorists that democratization was A, necessarily liberal, and B, an inevitable wave. Number two was the election of George W. Bush, which discredited the idea of interventionist internationalism and enabled China at a moment of growing economic strength to position itself internationally as a non-interventionist, honest broker in international society. The growth, I imagine that George W. Bush these days is extraordinarily grateful to the current President of the United States for making him look like a sort of sober, centrist, mainstream politician, but it didn't necessarily look that way 10 years ago. Third obvious point, but worth making, the growth in China's economy to second biggest economy in the world, first possibly by PPP, gave it geopolitical power that enabled it to extend its range. Although we're not going to do the India-China comparison, I think one of the best one-line answers to why will China continue to have influence and India not is China $8,000 per year, average GDP, India $3,500. Your starting point says a lot about your end point. Fourth point, China has become more energy hungry and commodity hungry, causing a new interest and securing interests in what I'm calling the medium abroad, as opposed to the near abroad or the far abroad. And fifth, the rise of a new form of nationalism. It becomes very kind of easy shorthand to talk about China becoming a nationalistic country. Actually, China's always been a nationalistic country in the modern era. Mao was an internationalist, but he was also an extremely strong nationalist. But the form of nationalism which exists now defines or redefines China's interests as being within a series of concentric circles. So Taiwan, perhaps the closest, the near abroad in terms of influence in the Asia-Pacific, South China Sea, and then the Indian Ocean sitting in that kind of medium range with further areas beyond, including Latin America, which exist in a rather different sort of set of connections. Linked to this, of course, are various developments, economic and military. First of all, the ability of the PLA Navy to project itself into the Indian Ocean marks a clear, if so far rather vaguely specified, policy in terms of power projection. I think there is absolutely no chance whatsoever of the Chinese Navy deciding to launch any kind of wider takeover of the Indian Ocean region. And I think the often heard, actually less heard nowadays, but for a few years, rather widely heard theory of the string of pearls, the influence of China in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka to try and contain India, was always driven by a sort of rather paranoid view of the way in which China tends to project power. I think there are serious issues with Chinese power projection in the South China Sea. I don't think the Indian Ocean is a specific part of that strategy at all. But the growth in Chinese defense spending to around 140 billion US dollars a year, of which the PLA Navy is a specific part, has enabled it to project itself further into the greater Indian Ocean. And the propagation of new Chinese military doctrines, including the new warfighting model, which emerges after the early, from 1993 onwards, and the idea of 综合国力, comprehensive national strength, as a wider goal, suggests that there is a clearer and wider understanding in China of the way in which what I posit is these concentric circles helps to define a Chinese role in what has become increasingly known as the Indo-Pacific, in a way that, as I say, in terms of contrast, is not true, let's say, for the waters off Latin America or indeed North America. I won't go here into the details of what's being said about the Chinese naval expansion, but Anatole, even for one, knows the current obsession with Mahan, Alfred Mahan, the great late 19th century American theorist of naval power, who is currently the hot read in China's military academies. And within that context, it's very clear that the PLA Navy and to some extent the PLA Air Force are now very much the favored children in the family of military development within China, China itself. So let me also then spend a minute or two, I've got about, 3 minutes or so? Yep, 3 minutes, lovely. To think ahead several stages and understand that the Eastern Indian Ocean, despite its relatively lower prominence in Chinese thinking, should be seen as part of a wider sense of advancement that includes the South China Sea as well. And here I want to come back to Singapore, which we've heard quite a lot about already. In recent years, Singapore has managed, I think, rather successfully to balance its traditional relationship with the United States alongside an engagement with China. However, Chinese pressure, for instance, the recent well-publicized case of Singapore defensive armored vehicles in Hong Kong being seized, shows, I think, a toughening of attitude towards the island state that's supplemented by a wider policy in the region of trying to suborn states within ASEAN as a means of trying to reorient traditional US-oriented alliances in the region. And that comes, of course, along with the wider regional policy of One Belt, One Road. We originally were going to have Professor Liu from Lin from Fudan University talking about this. Since he's not here, I'll just briefly mention that we're still in a very early stage of this idea of a new maritime and land-based Silk Road, the Bridge and Road Initiative, as it's put. But the idea, and it is an idea at the moment, of bringing some $8 trillion worth of infrastructural investment to the region is an ambitious one if it can be put forward. So far, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is one of the few extant parts of this infrastructure, and it was clearly pre-existing rather than being invented to order from the point of view of One Belt, One Road. But it is nonetheless an example of how a whole variety of security and other issues come together in terms of the realism of expanding Chinese presence in the region. So I've been told to wrap up, and I will do so by putting a question, which I hope will be answered in the course of our further discussion. This increasing projection of Chinese power, in which the Indian Ocean is an important but by no means an exclusive part, is leading China, as I said at the beginning, towards a pivot point, a choice. Having up to the 1990s and 2000s kept a low profile in international society, it is now clear that China wishes to project itself further in this as in other regions. But in doing so, it will be faced with more choices that will essentially force it to decide how sustainable the regional norm-driven order is and how much it wants to maintain it. This is partly an argument, of course, with John Eikenberry's famous theory that China is essentially a supporter and not an underminer of the existing liberal order. But when Eikenberry wrote 7 or 8 years ago, changes were already happening, which I suspect current developments here force us to rethink at a moment when liberal international norms are in danger. The US is a dissatisfied hegemon, which is a very odd sort of situation to be in that sense. And there's an ineffectiveness about international solutions to problems within a variety of regions that demand more Chinese investment if it wishes of political capital as well as money in terms of deciding how the region will go. So that is the question. Will China convert what it does now from where it is, which is sort of pragmatic defense of its growing backyard and its own interests, to not a model, let's not talk about a Chinese model, there's not going to be a Chinese model, but a set of norms, a nexus of ways of behavior and expectation that might finally challenge what for a very long time has been normative in this region. I'll leave it with that thought.
Thank you so much, Rana. I hope that you will get some interesting questions to this fascinating presentation. Next, we will move from the land of Hollywood and Captain Phillips to Afyare Elmi, who is going to speak about piracy and illegal fishing in the Horn of Africa, the role of the MENA region. So Afyare, please.
Well, let me start by thanking Harry and his colleagues for organizing this interesting conference. And let me again say a few words about why I'm here. Obviously, those of you who were following how the conference was organized, I was not in the list in the first. I was supposed to be chairing the session, I guess, but I ended up presenting. So the paper I'm about to give is one of the deliverables of a grant that I got from Qatar National Research Fund. It's an MBRP grant, so I have to give the credit before I even say anything. That's just a normal procedure, so I'm sorry for that. That said, I'll start with a context. By the way, this Indian Ocean region, the 30 states, the 30 littoral states, one of them is called Somalia, and the Iberian state that the colonial forces left behind in 1960 has collapsed in Somalia in 1990. Also, the liberal peace-building project that at least the West has been engaged in the past 27 years has also failed. So in the background, we have two very important issues, piracy and illegal fishing, which one can say are either consequence of or the cause of, statelessness in whichever way that you look at. So these are the two issues that I look at in this paper, and also within the context of the MENA region, how are the MENA countries or the Middle East and North African countries are affecting these issues or being affected by these two issues. So it's a complex issue, so I'll try to actually navigate within the next 15 to 20 minutes. And my structure in terms of how I want to approach is that I'll first give brief description of piracy, followed by illegal fishing, and then I will move to the political economic explanations given, and finally the role for MENA region, and I'll conclude. With respect to piracy, maritime piracy in the Horn of Africa, well, piracy, as we know, the legally defined pirate actions is a new phenomenon in the Horn of Africa, particularly in Somalia. And when I say that, I mean that Somalis were not engaged. I'm not saying that it has never happened in the region. In the historical, records, you will find that at least there were cases that used to take place either in Socotra or Rapta or some places that we debate whether they are in Eritrea today or Socotra, actually, we all know where it is. So basically, who were involved in those? Were they Indians? Were they others? Yeah, historical records talk about this. But when it comes to Somalis going to the sea and engaging in a pirate act, this is a new phenomenon. We do not have it in the historical records, and that was to us actually the group of people that were doing in this research. It was actually a new finding for us because we have seen some historians, anthropologists who wrote about this, saying that there were some cases. And we tried to explain, and we came up with 3 explanations. The first one was that Somalia's inward-looking nomadic culture is a one, glaring explanation that we could not ignore, simply because Somalis were not a seagoing people. That is actually a fact that was present. Second, particularly last 300 years, the British Empire was present in the area, and the punishment was quite harsh. And in fact, there was a case in that involved 2 Somali clans, sub-clans actually, that they fought inland, and then one of the clans had a boat that came from Aden and the other clan attacked, and British Empire, the captain that was present in Aden, considered this, if the savages are engaged in this, they might learn how to become a pirate. So they really attacked, and there was a huge punishment that was given. Wow, I mean, okay, I'll have to quickly move. And then, when you look at these things, you see that, well, there was a case, at least, that Somalis could not go. And the third one was that Somalis, did not even have the technology. I mean, people who were nomads, who did not have a culture of a seagoing, they could not go. So these were our main reasons that we found. Anyway, moving quickly, when it comes to the illegal fishing, that's different. It has been going on for quite a while. And what we have here is that at least a good number of the MENA countries are going to the Somali seas, and they are fishing illegally there. So you have these two things. You have Somali pirates that are going after 1991 to the sea and causing all kinds of destruction, and particularly, if you look at the statistics, 1,100 ships were attacked, and 300 of them were hijacked. So this actually was problematic. Somalis going to the sea, and other countries going also to the Somali seas, and this became quite complex. It fed to the narrative that the pirates were Coast Guard. It also fed to the narrative that Somalia is open for all. Jack Lang and many others argued that since Somalia has not declared its EEZ, anybody can go and fish from there. So you have these two issues. When it comes to then the question, and actually I'll be quick, if you have any question you can ask me in the question-answer session. In the Middle East or MENA role, here we have that when it comes to countering piracy, their contribution is extremely limited. You see that navies are largely Western navies. Few countries here and there are even China is sending 1 or 2 ships there. But when it comes to countering pirates via navies, MENA region is not contributing. When it comes to illegal fishing, the 3 top countries that illegally fish from the waters of Somalia are from the MENA region: Iran, Egypt, and Yemen. So these 3 countries go and fish from there. So here you have that MENA region contributing to the problem and not contributing to the solution. So this is the contradiction that the paper deals with, and hopefully I'm going to answer. I'm told that I ran out of time. If you have any questions on this. And the paper will be published, so obviously you'll see it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Afyare, for your excellent attention to time. Last but not least, Harry Verhoeven is speaking on taming intervention, African states, regime survival, and the political order.
Thank you so much, Rokhaya. The central problem that I want to speak about here is essentially a problem that I've been working on with my colleague, Ricardo, of whom you heard a lot this morning. It's the problem, essentially, of military intervention in small and weak states, which is, of course, one of the great constants in international history and in international relations. And it's, of course, closely affiliated with questions of state survival, and particularly in the 1990s and 2000s, the very permissive liberal international environment that was very conducive to all kinds of forms of interventionism. And the central question we are interested in the Indian Ocean space, but in Africa in particular, is how do small, feeble, weak states actually manage such threats to their state survival? How do they ensure that intervention and the reality and the pressures of military interventions do not overwhelm them? And this is a particularly important question, of course, in the context of African states that are faced with this permanent crisis, a permanent fiscal crisis, a permanent question of struggle over domestic political control, and of course on the receiving end of a whole set of international rules and norms which they themselves did not craft, over which they themselves had no say, but very much, of course, of which they are the objects. Now, the key argument that we make in this paper is that African states in the last 10, 15 years have counterintuitively actually come to embrace intervention, what we call taming intervention. That is to say that they have found ways to put the practice of intervention at the service of regime survival. An almost paradoxical trend that has been happening in international relations, whereby it is often the weak states that are some of the strongest proponents of military intervention. And the very reason for that, we argue, is the very fact that they've managed to erode intervention of much of its liberal content, which was all about remaking states and remaking societies and remaking the subjects, and have put it at the disposal of the creation of political order. That is to say, intervention is no longer about rogue regimes or rogue states, as it was in the 1990s and early 2000s. Today, it is about stabilization. And stabilization is an agenda that incumbents all across Africa are very happy to enlist. Now, it's important, of course, to provide some historical context here for the thinking about sovereignty, about intervention, about the international system from the African perspective. Now, as many of you will know, historically, most African states, as we would predict from IR theory, have been very fiercely sovereigntist. That is to say, they've been very strongly opposed rhetorically, but also in practice, to a lot of forms of international intervention, and particularly military intervention. And of course, this is a legacy in part of decolonization. As you know, in the context of Africa, decolonization was largely not by virtue of having proven to be a viable state, but merely by the fact of having been colonized. And contrary to previous eras where essentially there was a test of performance, in the case of when African states came into being, there was largely this element of judicial statehood by mere virtue of having been colonized, what we call statehood by bequest. Now, at the same time that this was happening, of course, remember, too, that African states crafted themselves an international regime through the Organization for African Unity that was built on three pillars, three very sovereigntist pillars. The first one, of course, is that of the inviolability and the unalterability of borders, that is to say, the acceptance of the borders as they came out of colonialism. African states essentially decided that they were not going to reverse these. Secondly, and closely associated with this, is absolute sovereignty over that patch of territory that was given to them. There was going to be no sharing of authority with any supranational organizations or with any other states. And the third element, the third corollary, is of course the principle of non-interference. There can be no intervention through the back door. If there's no changing of the borders, there's also no right to encourage, for example, secessionist movements in disparate parts of one's country. Now, all of this amounted to a very interesting international environment, and a very peculiar international environment, whereby African states experienced plenty of political turmoil, but as a whole, Africa experienced very little interstate wars. There was almost a complete absence of this, despite Africa's reputation for violent conflict. What was also remarkable, of course, was that African countries internationally continued to very much speak this language of anti-intervention, but in practice, of course, very happily drew on external resources, what Ricardo and Shareth have referred to before, the practice of extraversion, essentially drawing international discursive, military, financial, political resources from external patrons to consolidate power domestically. Now, this all, of course, began to change in the 1990s when you have this big, strong international push for a liberal order, for a remaking of subjects and of states. And we see this most visibly, of course, in the Balkans, but also in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in East Timor, in the form of these international protectorates, in which essentially sovereignty is suspended and countries are placed under international trusteeship in the name, of course, of building a liberal peace and building a new liberal order. Now, interestingly, Africa was wholly untouched by this phenomenon of the international protectorates. Africa in the 1990s would increasingly experience intervention, but not intervention in a liberal sense that was about to remake Africa and remake Africans. It was as if Africans were considered too primitive, too unruly, even lacking the basic foundations of political order for any such project to be implemented.
Now, in parallel, as I said, to this on the one hand, this absence, thank you so much, this absence to this on the one hand, this absence, thank you so much, this absence of this direct liberalism, there was this increase in intervention, which is not quite what we would predict. So where does this increase in intervention come from? Because between 1990 and 2009, we see a total of 60 peace operations happening. Some of these multilateral through the likes of the EU or the United Nations. Some of these bilateral carried out by, for example, by France or by Britain. And some of these, of course, under the umbrella of the incipient African Union put in place in the year 2002. So how do we account for this track record of growing intervention by Africans and by non-Africans, multilaterally as well as bilaterally? And I've put up a slide here just to give you an idea of how often Africa is intervened upon. These are just UN missions. This is not even about the AU or about the EU or even about NATO, which, as you know, intervened in Libya. But the key point is that we've seen this growing track record of the deployment of forces on the African continent. We can also see this, as I said, in bilateral ways, the growing presence of the United States on the ground in Africa in ways that were not possible during the Cold War, but also, of course, that of France, which has been, again, scaling up its presence pretty dramatically, very much at odds with, on the one hand, this language that France has of, it's an end of a neo-colonial era, France-Afrique is over and done with, but at the same time, this very strong deployment of forces, interestingly, with African consent. And so the key argument that we seek to make is that there has been a shift both in theory and in practice on the African continent, a wholesale embrace of intervention. And the key point to understand here, as I said, is that intervention proved malleable enough, fuzzy enough as a concept, to be emptied of its liberal content and increasingly be nudged in the direction of what is now understood as intervention as stabilization. These interventions are not meant to remake the whole of society. They are very limited in their objectives. They are very robust in the way they are carried out, but they are very limited in their societal objectives, and almost always they target non-state actors. They are to put down so-called terrorists or insurgents or any other identified problems with peace, but very rarely so to actually engineer regime change. And this is why you see this remarkable alignment, again, very much contrary to what we would predict in international relations theory, between Western neoconservatives, the Chinese Communist Party, Western liberals, and the African Union, all around this concept and this practice of intervention. And so intervention these days in Africa is not so much debated in normative terms, but largely in function of its modalities. How long, who exactly, how many troops? But the idea itself has become utterly uncontroversial. And we think this is a very interesting and very important trend, as the key problem is increasingly identified, indeed, as not that of rogue regimes, but that of weak states. Now, the very pertinent question for our project that emerges from this is, of course, what happens with the longer-term foundations of stabilization. In the long run, we may all agree that indeed certain actors are spoilers, or are insurgents, or are terrorists. But when it comes to the longer-term foundations of what actually provides societal stability and what actually looks like a viable agenda for post-conflict reconstruction, liberal tropes and, of course, more illiberal ideas, as, for example, put forward by the Chinese Communist Party, and Rana referred to it yesterday in his discussions, are, of course, resoundingly different. And so what we're suggesting here is that we're experiencing this convergence at this moment in time, but there will come a moment when far more radical and difficult choices will have to be made. But I'll leave it at that.